Good evening, distinguished professors, philosophers, and guests. My name is Heisook Kim, serving as the president of FISP, International Federation of Philosophical Societies. While I was listening, I didn't catch much of what has been said, but the concept like Zusammenleben aus Europan. I was thinking European philosophers, many European philosophers have thought about Europe itself. They took Europe as a kind of a philosophical problem. But I was wondering, I know very little about philosophers in other continents who put or posit their own continent as a philosophical problem. It's really an interesting kind of phenomenon. Japan even tried to be out of Asia and enter Europe. But you Europeans, Nietzsche, Wagner, or Husserl, all raised the question of Europe. It will be my homework to think about when I go back. Today, before I begin my talk, I'd really like to thank President Ruth Hagenburger and the German Philosophical Association for inviting me to this valuable occasion and to this memorable event, and also to the beautiful city of Paderborn. Personally, as a nation, I feel deeply touched at this moment because German philosophy has had a profound influence on East Asia. That influence goes far beyond philosophy itself, which makes this occasion even more meaningful for me. In today's talk, I would like to reflect on the background through which German philosophy was introduced into East Asia and on its philosophical and political implications. German philosophy has now become something that transcends the borders of Germany. Because philosophy, by its very nature, seeks universal truths, it has been studied, interpreted, and creatively transformed in many countries beyond Germany. Needless to say, German idealism and phenomenology, hermeneutics, as well as Marx's materialist dialectics, have had a major philosophical impact. Nietzsche, too, exerted great influence in existential philosophy, literature, and art. While inheriting the intellectual traditions of ancient Greece and medieval Europe, philosophy conducted in the German language developed, following Kant, into the tradition of German idealism, represented by thinkers such as Fichte, Hegel, and Schelling in the 18th and 19th centuries. From there, it evolved into diverse philosophical directions through the left Hegelians and Marx's materialist philosophy, Nietzsche's thought, Heidegger and Gadamer's hermeneutics, the Frankfurt School, Husserl's phenomenology, and later Heidegger, Jasper's existential philosophy, and Hannah Arendt's political philosophy. If we extend the bounds of philosophy to include broader intellectual activities such as Einstein's revolutionary scientific paradigm or Frege's logical and mathematical philosophy, the scope of German philosophy's contribution to the history of human thought becomes truly astonishing. I believe that the achievements of German philosophy within the history of human knowledge and civilization hold immense significance and influence. They represent one of the great accomplishments of the human mind and spirit. Classical German philosophy, as we see it, in the case of Kant, made possible a rigorous system of philosophy and a philosophy as theory. Here, philosophy is not direct knowledge of things, but rather meta-knowledge of what it means to know them. What stands out in traditional German philosophy is not merely the emergence of profound ideas, but rise of entirely new ways of thinking and philosophizing. Today, I would like to briefly examine the influence of German philosophy on the formation of modern East Asian intellectual traditions, and from the perspective of East Asian thought, consider the issues facing Western philosophy today with German philosophy at its forefront. The first, I would like to talk a little bit about German philosophy in East Asia. German philosophy has had a global impact, but for East Asians, especially in Japan and Korea, it carries a special significance. Japan was the first country in East Asia to translate Western philosophical terminology by using Chinese letters, and Korea and China later adopted these translated terms, which continue to be used today. Nishi Amane translated many philosophical terms into Sino-Japanese using Chinese characters. Core Western philosophical concepts such as reason, freedom, and concept were thus rendered in Chinese characters, and within the Sino-graphic cultural sphere, these terms took firm root. Nishi Amane, who studied in the Netherlands and later became a leading figure in Japan's modernization after the Meiji Restoration, introduced positivism, empiricism, and utilitarianism to Japan in his earlier period. In the early stages of modernization, Japanese intellectuals were largely influenced by British empiricism and French Enlightenment thought, as these aligned well with Japan's modernization project. Empiricism emphasized empirical, scientific, and practical approaches which suited the development of technology, law, and political institutions. Later, however, German scholarship, especially idealism, historicism, and legal philosophy rose to prominence and came into tension with empiricism. German thought stressed state morality, community, and historical development, which matched Japan's growing nationalism and its effort to legitimize the emperor system. As empiricism did not serve well to justify authority, tradition, or a strong state ideology, the state and official academia gravitated toward German idealism. Inoue Tetsujiro was a representative advocate of German idealism. Having studied in Germany and taught at Tokyo Imperial University, he promoted a philosophy of national morality and justified the imperial rescript on education in 1890 as the moral foundation of the state. He criticized the Western liberal individualism as morally dangerous. Japanese intellectuals saw in the German idealist conception of the self, or I, as the highest principle of knowledge and an affinity with the emperor-centered order. While the empiricism and liberalism of thinkers like Nishi Amane contributed to Japan's modernization in the areas of individualism, civic rights, and scientific progress, it was German idealism that provided the philosophical foundation for state-centered modernization, thereby legitimizing Meiji system. By the late 1880s, empiricism and liberalism had been marginalized, and German idealism became dominant, institutionalized as a state ideology that provided philosophical justification for the Meiji regime. The intellectual struggle between empiricism and German idealism culminated in the establishment of the Meiji Constitution in 1889 and the imperial rescript on education in 1980. Philosophers advocating state supremacy adapted Kant's reconciliation of freedom and duty to justify moral obligations to the state, and employed Hegel's notion of the state as the realization of historical reason to support the imperial system and a strong centralized state. In Korea, the Joseon dynasty had adopted Neo-Confucianism as its state ideology, sustaining it for over 500 years. Confronting the limitations of Confucian society, some intellectuals turned to Christianity and through it came to study Western thought and science, collectively referred to as sohag. It means Western learning. In response, a native movement known as Tongha, it means Eastern learning, emerged, which became the ideological foundation of the Tongha Peasant Revolution in 1894, a popular uprising against the existing political order. Whether through Western learning or Eastern learning, however, Joseon failed to overcome the structural crises of its dynastic system or the challenges of the modern era. By remaining closed off from the West, Korea eventually fell prey to Japan's imperial ambitions and was occupied by Japan for 35 years. Korea's systematic encounter with Western philosophy began during the colonial period through Japan, where German idealism already had a privileged position in academia. At Keijo Imperial University, now it is Seoul National University, many Japanese professors were graduates of Tokyo University or Kyoto University, where they had studied under Nishida Kitaro. They mainly taught Kant, Hegel, and Husserl's phenomenology, and their influence continued even after Korea's liberation. The adoption of Western philosophy has created two sectors in Korea, leftist and rightist. Park Ji-woo was the representative intellectual who adopted Marxism and became political activist in the Korean Communist Party. And another one is Park Jong-hong, who studied at Tokyo Imperial University from 1929 to 1932, where he researched Heidegger. Upon returning to Korea, Park taught both Eastern and Western philosophy, but German philosophy remained at the core of philosophical studies in Korea. For decades, Korean philosophers actively studied German idealism, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Husserl, and this trend continued until the 1970s, when Anglo-American analytic philosophy was introduced and widely disseminated. With the later influx of postmodernism, however, interest and research in German philosophy significantly declined. In China, the early introduction of Western philosophy took place through scholars such as Feng Yulan and Jin Yuelin, who studied at Columbia University and taught at Tsinghua University, as well as Hu Xi, also educated at Columbia, and Zhang Dongsan, who had studied in Japan, Germany, and Britain, and later taught at Peking University. These scholars primarily taught Anglo-American metaphysics, logic, philosophy of language, positivism, and pragmatism. Even with regard to German philosophy, their focus leaned more toward the neo-Kantian school and phenomenology rather than German idealism. In addition to these philosophers, I'd like to mention Jin Dok-soo in Korean pronunciation, but Chen Du-shi. He taught modern Western thought in Peking University from 1918 through 1921, but he later became a political leader, providing the ideological foundation for the Chinese Communist Party. After the Communist Revolution, the study of Western philosophy in China became highly restricted. The influence of German philosophy in China thus came primarily through Marx's dialectical materialism, differing from the path it took in Japan and Korea. Nonetheless, in terms of overall impact, it is fair to say that German philosophy exerted a profound influence in East Asia. The German philosophy that came to East Asia went through processes of adaptation, compromise, and synthesis with the region's indigenous intellectual traditions, creating a distinctive intellectual landscape that continues to this day. I'll move to the second part, philosophy and politics. One of the most intriguing aspects of the reception of German philosophy, especially German idealism, in Japan and Korea is its close relationship with politics. As mentioned earlier, the self-centered and active subjectivity emphasized in German idealism provided the ideological support for the emperor-centered state ideology in Japan. In other words, the emphasis on centrality, unity, and totality found philosophical justification through German idealism. The Meiji Restoration literally means renewal by reforming what is old. The term itself embodies a paradox, the fusion of reform and restoration, as it restored the tenuous institution. Interestingly, the same word Yushin, Meiji Restoration, can be expressed in written in Chinese letters. The pronunciation is Yushin in Korean pronunciation. Yushin derived from this Japanese concept of restoring the strong centrality based on German idealist philosophy later appeared in modern Korean history by the dictator Park Chung-hee. In 1960, President Park Chung-hee seized power in South Korea, and in order to solidify his long-term rule and authoritarian control, promulgated the Yushin Constitution in 1972 and introduced the Charter of National Education in 1968. These policies promoted state-led development and patriotic education grounded in loyalty to the nation and people. The Yushin Project was modeled after Japan's Meiji Restoration and aimed to establish a strong, centralized authority. At the time, Park Chung-hong, the representative philosopher in the period, participated with other 26 members in drafting the Charter of National Education, much like leading Japanese philosophers had contributed to the imperial rescript on education in Meiji era. In Korea, German idealism did not stand out in any prominent way as the philosophical foundation of the Yushin system. The reason, I believe, is that even though the underlying education ideals of Korean Yushin, encouraging patriotic devotion to the state through active subjectivity, self-discipline, and enlightenment through learning, fit well with the idealist emphasis on the self and its teleological productive movement, they were also well aligned with the Confucian ideal of self-cultivation and loyalty long cherished in the traditional Korea. German idealism, as it entered East Asia, located the foundation of knowledge in the subject, the self, as an active agent that judges the world through autonomous, spontaneous consciousness rather than passive reception. In Japan, this framework was analogically applied to establish the emperor as the central subject of the state, the living embodiment of its unity. The emperor represented the subject, while the people were regarded as manifestations of the emperor's will. Similarly, Korea's Yushin system aimed to construct a strong national subjectivity, and the Yushin Constitution opened the way for that dictatorship under a leader symbolizing that national subject. Even North Korea's Juche ideology was influenced by German idealism. maybe I may go too extreme, but I will focus on this aspect. Hwang Jang-yeop, the principal architect of Juche thought, studied in Japan between 1941 and 1944 under professors associated with the Kyoto School, and is known to have been deeply drawn to idealism, especially Hegelian idealism. It is remarkable that Marxist-Leninist materialism, which served as the official state ideology in North Korea, underwent an idealist transformation in North Korea's Juche philosophy, emphasizing human autonomy, creativity, self-consciousness, and will. The literal meaning of Juche in Korean is subjectivity. The core principle of Juche philosophy is, quote, man is the master of everything and decides everything, unquote. This emphasis on human active subjectivity translated into relentless ideological education directed at the people, reinforcing the spirit of we can do it for our country, therefore we must do it. Thus, the strong ego and consciousness-centered orientation of German idealism was appropriated in East Asia to support state-centered or leader-centered political ideologies. However, it would be misleading to claim that German idealism in East Asia served only to justify authoritarianism or nationalism. Nor should the emergence of nationalism, totalitarianism, or dictatorship be viewed as a direct product of philosophy itself. From a philosophical standpoint, the emphasis on consciousness, autonomy, and subjectivity was originally intended to affirm human freedom and dignity. The concept of freedom, grounded in self-determined purposes, principles, and will, where individuals autonomously shape and recreate their own lives, was quite foreign to traditional East Asian thought, which understood the personal meaning of life and freedom primarily in terms of relational roles and social harmony within the established social status orders. Furthermore, the idea of building a political system that guarantees equal political rights based on individual freedom was almost unimaginable within the classical East Asian worldview. German idealism's stress on synthesizing freedom, autonomy, and individuality into a universal whole through the creative and constructive power of a spirit sought to affirm individual freedom, subjective world construction, and establishment of truth, not to advocate submission to totalitarian authority. Therefore, it would be excessive to portray German idealism itself as inherently political or claim that the idealists pursued political objectives. Rather, individuals or groups driven by a will to power appropriated and reinterpreted this unfamiliar philosophical system to serve their own political ends. The relationship between philosophy and politics can itself be seen as a profound philosophical problem. Marx envisioned the unity of theory and practice and believed that philosophy would come to an end only when his utopian vision of a realized world became reality. In Marx's utopia, philosophy ends because it is fully realized in life. In contrast, in the postmodern worldview, philosophy might end precisely because such realization is impossible from the start. For example, for postmodern skeptics like Derrida, who proclaim the closure of metaphysics, there is no utopia that could bring about the final realization of philosophy. Yet Marx's utopia has not been realized, and even the most skeptical thinkers continue in their practical lives to believe that the world exists and that the language they speak possesses definite meaning, if not truth. Thus, the end of philosophy has not yet arrived in Marxist traditions or in postmodern cultures. In both the Marxist and postmodern contexts, politics enters the process of realizing or deconstructing philosophy. Marxism strives to realize philosophy or truth in practice, whereas postmodern strives to expose philosophy truth as a kind of an illusion. It is in the midst of this process of bringing philosophy to an end that politics enters. At times, politics seeks to expedite the process. At other times, it makes self-refuting claims that the process has already ended and that all truth claims are a scam. Philosophical struggle becomes political struggle, just as political struggle becomes philosophical. Korea, divided by ideologies born in the West, has thus become in itself a kind of philosophical subject, as Europa is a kind of a philosophical problem. A nation that once devoted 5 centuries to realizing Confucian philosophy in social life has now become a battleground for philosophical conflicts. Each East Asian country in its own historical context has forged its modern history through the dynamic interplay between philosophy and politics. And within that interplay, German philosophy has formed one of the central pillars. The last part, philosophy and the world. In the history of Western philosophy, the secure path of science that Kant envisioned for philosophy has now largely been ceded to science itself. Kant's transcendental philosophy faces a fundamental difficulty. It cannot justify the transcendental standpoint itself theoretically without circularity. Through idealism, philosophy became a distinctive discipline confined within self-reflective, self-referential thought. The self, subject, and spirit, which German idealism regarded as the supreme principles of philosophy, were transformed in modern times into history, linguistic discourse, culture, and communication. Influenced by the rise of science and positivism, naturalists, materialists, and realists sought to move beyond the philosophical subjectivism centered on the thinking self, rallying around the slogans like "Let consciousness fall where it may," as Quine in his naturalized epistemology claimed, or "knowledge without the knowing subject," as Popper proposed. It seems that the philosophical pursuit of rigorous objectivity of knowledge no longer stimulates the intellectual curiosity of philosophers as it once did, owing perhaps both thanks and no thanks to the rapid developments in cognitive science, neuroscience, and neurophysiology. Philosophy have increasingly shifted their focus from theoretical philosophy to practical philosophy, cultural philosophy, and social and political philosophy, that is, philosophy of the Lebenswelt. As already foreshadowed in the later works of Heidegger and Husserl, and as anticipated by the American neo-pragmatist Richard Rorty, Western philosophy has come to take on a very different form. Within this transformation, the influence of German philosophy, which had once proposed new worldviews and methodological rigor, seems to be weakened. Where then will philosophy go, having lost its claim to methodological strictness and rigor that might rival those of the natural sciences? How can it overcome the problem of arbitrariness in scholarly practice? If philosophy itself becomes arbitrary, then our understanding of the world and life will likewise become arbitrary and contingent. In contemporary times, Western theoretical philosophy increasingly engages in active collaboration and convergence with other disciplines such as science, computer engineering, medicine, and psychology. In doing so, it often loses touch with its traditional foundations, becoming absorbed and transformed within natural science, technology, or artistic practices. Therefore, another crucial pillar of philosophy, practical philosophy, the discourse on norms, values, justice, and morality, will continue to form the core of philosophical inquiry. The attitude and training required to view life as an encompassing whole remain philosophy's primary vocation. The problems of philosophy have always been closely tied to the problems of life, and from ancient East to ancient West, philosophers treated them as the most important questions. Indeed, what could be more fundamental to humanity than the question of life itself? Yet human life always requires context because humans have bodies and as living organisms must act to sustain those bodies. We cannot speak of human life without referring to time and space. Our understanding of different eras, nations, and cultures arises from this existential condition. Humans live embodied, contextual lives. For this reason, I believe philosophy must now look beyond national boundaries to examine the conditions of human life across different cultures and societies. It is time to borrow Wittgenstein's metaphor for philosophy to return from its holiday, to set its feet on the ground and engage actively with the real world. In truth, philosophy has always crossed borders. Western European philosophy shows traces of influence from Egypt, India, and China. Eastern philosophy likewise constructed its identity by transcending national boundaries. Leibniz, for instance, interpreted his binary system through the lens of yin-yang theory as providing a metaphysical principle of the universe. Even in modern times, yin-yang theory can be useful in explaining the worldview of quantum mechanics, and conversely, Bohr's principle of complementarity can deepen our understanding of yin-yang theory. The French Enlightenment thinkers admired and adopted Confucian philosophy as a form of rational moral philosophy. Great intellectual traditions have always transcended national boundaries, opening new horizons of thought for humanity. This is why we must take a deep interest in the intellectual traditions and worldviews of other cultures. Western philosophy is deeply intertwined not only with Christian tradition but also with the development of mathematics and physics. Eastern philosophy, on the other hand, is closely connected to the religious traditions of Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and shamanism, as well as to the sciences of the human body and of life. This connection is manifested in medicine, pharmacology, agriculture, rituals, humanistic geography, and so on. Philosophy is an endless field of debate and dialogue. German philosophy, in particular, demonstrated how humans, independent of divine authority, could pursue truth through rational thought. To establish philosophy as a field with its own methodology and intellectual agenda, distinct from theology, German philosophers exerted extraordinary effort, and today's discipline of philosophy owes much to their achievements. Now, however, we live in an age of civilizational transformation through digitalization, biotechnology, and emerging digital currencies, a world vastly different from the analog age we once knew. The questions that once seemed familiar to us, those of freedom, equality, justice, labor, race, gender, and class, now await new forms of philosophical reflection. As AI becomes universal, it is difficult to predict how human existence and life will change. Every epochal shift demands a philosophical transformation. Today, philosophy must confront the tension between the mechanized human and the humanized machine. I hope that German philosophy, facing this new historical challenge, will draw actively on the modes of thought and worldviews of other cultures, and through such dialogue, move toward new creative possibilities. Thank you.